Hi there, this is the second part of the lesson 2.02 read aloud recording. And we're just starting here on this first full paragraph. John Adams argued for the formation of an American Continental Army. He then made a speech about who should lead it. Not Hancock, who had organized Massachusetts' militia and saw himself as a logical choice, but Virginia's military hero from the Seven Years' War, George Washington. Put Washington in charge of the New York militiamen, Adams insisted, enlist new troops, and create a continental army. Doubtful murmurs gave way to hearty approval. The idea that a military man from Virginia would lead troops drawn from Massachusetts and soon from Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey inspired the delegates with a sense of unity. Washington accepted the job without pay. He left immediately for Boston. When he arrived, the militiamen were still congratulating themselves on the performance at Bunker Hill, but Washington was distressed to see how disorganized they were. When he asked how many militiamen were present, an aide told him about 20,000. Washington ordered an exact count, and it took 8 days to learn that the true number of those fit for duty was closer to 14,000. A proper army, Washington observed, would have been able to count its soldiers in a matter of hours. His first task was to turn these freedom-loving militiamen into disciplined soldiers. Guards had to stay on duty, soldiers needed to obey orders, and no one could be allowed to wander off as he pleased. As Washington began to train his men, he also made plans to attack the British soldiers still under siege in Boston and recovering from their wounds suffered at Concord and Bunker Hill. In March 1776, Washington ordered the cannon that had been taken from Fort Ticonderoga to be placed atop Dorchester Heights south of Boston. In a stealthy maneuver, American forces took the hill unopposed, erected fortifications, and installed the cannon. Seeing the risk, General William Howe ordered his British troops to evacuate Boston. They hurriedly sailed to Nova Scotia, where they regrouped for the battles ahead. Washington had achieved his first victory. Declaring independence. In Philadelphia, delegates at the Second Continental Congress agonized over what steps to take next, even as they attended to pressing practical matters such as authorizing the printing of money and establishing a post office. In accomplishing such tasks and overseeing the raising of an army, the Continental Congress was little by little taking on the task of governing the colonies. Many delegates thought of the Continental Congress as equivalent to, but separate from, Parliament. They thought the Congress could remain like Parliament loyal to the king. While some spoke of declaring independence, others, such as John Dickinson, urged the same respect for the mother country that he had favored in his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. Dickinson wrote that what became known as the Olive Branch Petition. This formal request to the king urged a peaceful way out of the conflict and offered some American concessions. The king ignored the petition and instead prepared for war by hiring thousands of German troops, commonly known as Hessians, because many of them came from the German state of Hesse-Cassel. Even as Pennsylvania's John Dickinson was crafting his olive branch petition, he was also working with a brilliant young delegate from the Virginia House of Burgesses, Thomas Jefferson. Together they wrote a declaration of the causes and necessity for taking up arms. This document did not plead for peace. It accused Parliament of enslaving those colonies by violence and forcing colonists to fight for their rights as Englishmen. It offered the reassurance that we have not raised armies with ambitious designs of separating from Great Britain and establishing independent states, but in language that stopped just short of a threat, it made it clear that the colonists were quite ready to take up such a bold step. Our cause is just, our union is perfect, our internal resources are great, and if necessary, foreign assistance is undoubtedly attainable. Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Should the colonies demand their rights but remain part of the British Empire? Or should they, as a few voices whispered, declare independence? A 50-page pamphlet from an unlikely source helped many Americans make up their minds. Thomas Paine was a struggling Englishman who had failed at almost everything he had tried. He had been a corset maker, a customs official, and a tutor. On November 1774, he arrived in Philadelphia and tried his hand as a journalist. He published an article denouncing the slave trade. He wrote with passion. After the battle at Lexington, he passionately argued the Americans must declare independence. In his pamphlet called Common Sense, Paine spelled out the reasons why the colonies should sever all ties with England. Unlike other writers of the time who tried to impress their audience with Greek and Roman references, Paine spoke in plain and bold, direct language, offering, as he put it, nothing more than simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense. Paine vividly described the folly of England, a tiny faraway island attempting to rule a continent 3,000 miles distant. Small islands not capable of protecting themselves are the proper places for kingdoms to take under their care. But there's something very absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island, Paine wrote. Moreover, he said, the English monarchy has grown corrupt and tyrannical. America, by contrast, had law been the asylum from persecuted lovers of civil and religious liberty from every part of Europe. Paine's forceful essay elevated the colonist cause from rebellion against unjust taxes to a universal struggle of people everywhere against the oppressive government. The cause of American government, Paine wrote, is the cause of all mankind. Common Sense publicly urged independence for the first time. While some Patriot leaders, such as John Adams, were working behind the scenes to urge a formal break from England, most still sought some reconciliation that would maintain the colonies as part of Britain. But not Thomas Paine, who boldly stated, "The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, 'tis time to part!" Common Sense prodded colonists not to think of a break with Britain as a sad loss of ties to the dear mother country. Instead, said Paine, they must see independence as an unprecedented opportunity to create a new republic. Paine knew that many colonists might think of a republic as an ineffective, unstable form of government. After all, the last time Englishmen had experimented with republican government was during the 17th century, and that had not gone well. The Puritan leader Oliver Cromwell dissolved Parliament and ruled as a military dictator. But, said Paine, republics were not flawed by nature. Instead, he insisted, republics were the freest, most reasonable, and the most peaceful of states ruled by the will of the people, not the whim of a monarch. A government of our own is our natural right, he claimed. Moreover, to form a constitution of our own in a cool, deliberate manner would reap great rewards. By breaking with Britain, said Paine, Americans had it in their power to begin the world over again. Common Sense was published in Philadelphia in January 1776. Within months, 120,000 copies circulated throughout the colonies. From her farm in Massachusetts, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, John, asking what the other delegates to the Continental Congress thought of the pamphlet. He replied that some men criticized Paine's heated writing, but all agreed there is a great deal of good sense delivered in clear, simple, concise, and nervous style. Away with his troops, George Washington noted that Common Sense was beginning to work a wonderful change in the minds of many men. Indeed, the little pamphlet was changing the minds of Americans throughout the colonies, who more and more spoke openly of the prospect of a complete separation with Britain. Natural Rights and the Declaration of Independence. Months before Paine's passionate cry for independence, John Adams had reached the same conclusion. In the early spring of 1776, in sessions of the Second Continental Congress, he worked tirelessly to convince his fellow delegates of the need for a separation from England. But he knew that many delegates considered New Englanders like himself too hot-headed and one-sided in the cause of independence. To persuade delegates who remained undecided or still loyal to Britain, Adams needed other voices to press the initiative. He turned his attention to the delegates from Virginia. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia rose on the floor of the Continental Congress to comply with the instruction received from his colony. He introduced a resolution that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. While the Congress debated this resolution, a committee was appointed to explain the resolution by drafting a Declaration of Independence. And here is an excerpt from Thomas Paine's Common Sense. And we'll keep going to the page we need to pick up our reading at. The committee consisted of 5 men: Massachusetts' John Adams, Pennsylvania's Benjamin Franklin, Virginia's Thomas Jefferson, New York's Robert Livingston, and Connecticut's Roger Sherman. At the insistence of Adams, the task of writing the Declaration was put in Jefferson's hands. Facing a deadline set by Congress, Jefferson retired to a second-story parlor in Philadelphia. Over the course of about 2 weeks, he changed the terms of the debate with England. Unlike earlier Patriot writers, Jefferson did not demand the colonists' rights as Englishmen. Instead, he made a more fundamental claim. Certain rights, he said, are common to all mankind. In making this claim, Jefferson was building on the Enlightenment philosophy of natural rights, most famously articulated in the 17th century English philosopher John Locke. In his 2 treatises of government, Locke had argued that a government is obliged to protect its people's natural rights of life, liberty, and property. If a government fails to do so, then, says Locke, its people have the right to replace the government, just as the English people had replaced their king and given Parliament more power in the Glorious Revolution. Jefferson drafted a document in which he eloquently proclaimed that all men are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain inherent and inalienable rights, including the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Including the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He then listed ways in which King George III had failed to protect these rights in the colonies, and thus deserved scorn as a tyrant. The list included many grievances: taxation without representation, establishment of military dictatorships, limitations on trade, and encouraging the slave trade. After Jefferson handed over his draft to the Congress, the delegates, many of them fellow lawyers, proceeded to debate and revise the text. They eliminated the controversial charge about encouraging the slave trade. The phrase inherent and inalienable rights was changed to certain and unalienable rights. But then they left intact the ringing preamble that established the philosophical foundation of the new nation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. From that bold statement, however incompletely understood or practiced in 1776, much of American history would follow. When it came time to vote on the document, John Hancock, the president of the Congress, asked for unanimous support. There must be no pulling different ways, he said. We must all hang together. Yes, replied Benjamin Franklin, who promptly added, probably recalling the king's threat to execute those who supported the rebellion, we must indeed hang together, or most assuredly we will all hang separately. On July 4, 1776, the Second Continental Congress unanimously adopted the Declaration of Independence. It was a momentous occasion, the start of the first modern war for independence against a colonial power. Americans renounced their allegiance to the British Crown and proclaimed their determination to totally dissolve their political bonds with Britain. Even more important, they embarked on an unprecedented experiment in Republican government. Okay, we'll go back here. So make sure your reading guide is completed, and then at the next page, make sure that you complete the Leaders of the American Revolution activity. Go through that one, and go all the way to the end, and then also make sure you complete Common Sense, this activity as well. So go through and complete those to the very end. And then you get to take a checkpoint where you put in a keyword you received at the end of the Common Sense online activity. So good luck on finishing up lesson 2.02.